Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Anthony Mead, and I am the director of the Morlan Gallery here at Transylvania University. And with that, it is my great pleasure to welcome our guests tonight, Annica Cuppetelli and Cristobal Mendoza. Annica and Chris are currently showing their work O Movement in Morlan's exhibition Subtle, which ends tomorrow at 5 p.m. So if you haven't seen it yet, or if you want a second or third or fourth viewing, I highly encourage you to come by tomorrow between noon and 5 to see all of the amazing work in the show, including O Movement. If any of you haven't been to Morlan in a while, say due to the pandemic, please note that we are open to the public again, and that masks are required anywhere on Transylvania University's campus, including in the gallery. If this is your first time joining us for one of our virtual artist talks, let me give you a little lay of the land here. So we do have a live closed captioning feature available. You can turn that on by taking your cursor down to the bottom of this browser window and clicking on the little CC icon. Also down at the bottom of that menu bar, you will find a Q&A button. We use a Q&A button to enable a chat function, and then you can type your questions in there at any time. We'll reserve those questions to the end, and I will ask them for you to our guests. Cuppetelli and Mendoza began collaborating in 2010 and are based out of Detroit, Michigan. Their work has been exhibited nationally and internationally at venues such as the Denver Art Museum, the Biennial de Video and Artistes in Medellín, Chile, in festivals such as Nemo 2013 in France, Scopitone 2012 also in France, ISEA 2012, File 2011 in Brazil, FAD 2011 in Brazil, Video Dumbo 2013 and 2011 in New York, and in 2015, they were selected as the Kresge Arts in Detroit Fellows. Cuppetelli received an MFA in Fibers from Cranbrook Academy of Art and is currently teaching at the University of Michigan. Mendoza received an MFA in Digital and Media from Rhode Island School of Design. These two incredibly talented artists create installations and objects that combine dynamic physical elements with digital technologies, composing sensual, immersive, dynamic experiences. Their works speak in a poetic language of elegance that visually is minimal and focuses our attention on the parts, the whole, and the relationship between those. For us as viewers, we are often finding ourselves in their work by directly interacting with it, creating moments of surprise and wonder. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Cuppetelli and Mendoza.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you, Transylvania University, for inviting us. We wish that we could be there in person, but c'est la COVID be. Yes. It's an honor, and we are truly grateful to be invited. So shall we share our screen? And all right. All right, and can you see our screen? Okay. All right, great.
Yep.
All right. So thanks for the introduction as well. There were some nice things in there. And I also wanted to say before we even start, because our presentation is titled Lines of Space, which is basically a little bit of the origin story of our work. But also, a thing that is going to keep coming up and up is that our work is about experience. And experience right now, wow, it's hard to experience, but it's always difficult, of course, to communicate, our work via documentation because you're not experiencing it. Thankfully, you guys have at least one of our installations there, so maybe there's a good reference point for us to be talking about our work. But our work is always going to revolve around that idea of experience in some kind of way. So yeah, we should maybe keep that in mind. All right, so a little bit about us. So we come from two very different backgrounds, and so maybe you can start with yours.
Yeah. As Anthony kind of introduced, my background is in fiber and in fashion are my interest. So I'm a fiber artist whose work and research crosses over many different mediums. And a lot of it's through collaboration too. Crosses over between fiber and sculpture, fiber and fashion, and architecture, and the relationship to the body of space and fabric. These pieces here are all kind of bringing in women's labor. They're woven basketry techniques, but then I'm also doing all these sculptures. Go to the next one. Out of corsetry. So it's all corset material that I'm using, kind of bringing in and wanting to talk about the politics of the way fashion affected women and also really kind of limited their roles in society and what that really meant by this binding and this material, but also garment. And I think that's kind of, spatially kind of thinking about our work.
I mean, obviously our work maybe, or collaborative work is not so political, but it definitely shares a lot of formal concerns. The idea of space and architecture and the body as the site where, basically experience happens. Yeah. My background, in contrast, is very much computery. I've always been somebody that is that has felt very empowered by computers. And this is one of my first pieces. This is called Ghostly Mirror. And, I'm putting it out here for cred. 2003, a long time ago, I was doing video interactive stuff. So yeah, tell your NFT friends, we've been here for a while. So together, we are then bringing these two seemingly very disparate disciplines, fibers and computers, but they're not so dissimilar because in fact, fibers, you can consider it as the original tech. And in fact, the first programmable machine, which is what you're seeing over here, was the Jacquard loom. The Jacquard loom is a machine that was created to automate the process of weaving. And that was done via the use of punch cards. So, we think of punch cards, old school technology, 50s. But no, we're talking what, like 1800s? Yeah. Maybe 1700s, late 1700s, right? So, fibers and digital technologies, maybe not so dissimilar. So before we start talking about our work, I think we want to talk a little bit about our influences. This piece over here is called Penetrable by Jesus Soto. And in particular, I'm Venezuelan. So I'm from the country formerly known as Venezuela. I don't know, are we still called Venezuela? It's possible. Anyhow, Soto was a well-known Venezuelan artist from the mid-20th century. And together with Carlos Cruz Diez, they created what was later known as Venezuelan constructivism. And they were very interested in the idea of experience. Cruz Diez was more interested in color, and Soto was more interested in maybe playfulness, but also like optical movement. I think our work has a great debt to both of these artists, but we are also referencing a lot of contemporary artists. Olafur Eliasson, for instance, this is a good example of experience art that's very minimal, but very interesting, room for one color. Other artists that we really enjoy, James Terrell.
Coming out of the light and space movement in the 60s.
Fred Sandback, which we also directly reference, or almost directly reference in our work. His beautiful, very delicate line work is really just amazing to experience in person. And again, it's just some of these works, and I think all of these works, they're very hard to see in documentation, and they share sort of the need for in-person experience that a lot of work or a lot of things nowadays don't really require. So they demand your presence. Say, not like a movie, where a movie we can watch it basically nowadays anywhere, even in your house, and it's basically the same thing as the theater, right? All right, so with that bit of background set, we're going to talk now about our main work called nervous structure. So nervous structure, sort of the first iterations, it looked like this. So what is nervous structure? So nervous structure is basically a sculpture that consists of strings that are illuminated by a video projector. And this video projection is interactive. So when a viewer moves in front of it, the projection reacts just as you see. Now the camera, the way that this works is that there's a video camera, usually underneath the piece somewhere, and that's looking at the scene ahead of it. And when you move in front, that video image gets sent to a computer. The computer processes it, understands or tries to understand the motion that's happening in front of the camera, and then applies those motion vectors to some graphics that or the physical simulation that yeah.
And then this example of this piece was really where this conversation of our collaboration started too, going back to line and space. And our studios were right next to each other. You were working on the program and I'm more sculptural, let's just say. And I was like, what if you project on a line? And these are some early kind of iterations of us just kind of playing with that idea of projection, line, and movement, and what we could kind of do with that.
Right. And I like showing these things too, because some of, especially like digital work, always seems so kind of polished, or there's never any like there's never any in between spaces, any in between steps. The digital work tends to be like either works or it doesn't work, right? It's very binary. But these guys, I think these pictures show you where the work really was. I mean, these were just us messing around in the studio. I mean, on the picture on the right, you can see how the camera is atop and it's actually like clamped to a wall. So there's a very real physicality to these things, even though they're very highly digitally mediated. Well, before we move on, just a bit of like overview in terms of how these things work. There may be a sculpture, there's a projector, and the projector is usually above the sculpture. Okay. To have this sort of a dialogue, if you will, between the virtual and the physical, and foregrounds and backgrounds. So it's always a piece that is about in betweens.
And you can see on this one too, we also really enjoy reacting to a site. So really considering the space, the way the viewer would walk in, how are they going to view the piece, how are they going to interact with it, and really kind of studying that. And then applying these things as we have learned, looking at this one that is from 2011, the way that it's reacting or the way that we did it, this was an early on almost piece that we learned a lot from. And I guess I'm kind of saying that too, and especially for the students out there, that, keeping on pushing an idea. And we're big believers of that because we still are learning from our first question, and kind of keep on pushing that.
Yeah, your first iteration is always crappy. So we are on the umpteenth iteration of these, and they keep getting better, and you always keep learning from them. So that's sort of the advantage, or the yeah, the advantage of doing something over and over again. There's always something to be learned from it. And, you know, especially when you work physically, which is something that I wasn't particularly used to. You know, working with a physical material always teaches you, because you have to set it up all the time. Whereas, you know, computer program, yeah, I keep working on the computer program all the time too. But, you know, once it's set up, you know, you can just reuse it. Whereas even if you want to use the same ideas with a physical material, you're always learning. But anyhow, just making is always learning. Slightly different materials over here. I like this one because it's the only one that we did with those tubes of spandex.
Yeah,
So basically made these really long spandex.
Yeah, these
socks.
were, again, like always, me being more of a material based and a more three-dimensional medium. So what we've been doing is we started with string that didn't stretch, and then we went to elastic, and then I was sewing these tubes out of spandex. And so kind of also just kind of pushing the materials too. Also with this idea of interaction and what we could do with it. And this one, I think was really successful because somebody thought it was neon. Everybody thought instead of that there was projection. So there was a sense of like mystery that was happening with it, or a sense of discovery. And those are things I think that are really important as artists to think about it, to get people to live with your pieces a little bit longer too. That it's not the first thing that you see, but kind of keeping people there too.
Yeah. So just so you get a sense, that's the way it's, you know, with the lights on, that's the way when it's illuminated with a projector. So obviously, you know, our work tends to live in a lot of really dark rooms. This doesn't look very dark because the exposure is long, but it was a little bit darker. So again, you know, iteration, this is just a, you know, a different installation. This is in Brazil. You know, we kept evolving the concept. So as you see, the movement from those three that I showed you earlier is very different than the movement that you see now. And that's one of the nice things about working with software, is that it's easy to, or not easy, but you know, software always evolves. You can always add features, and you can always experiment and add new things without, you know, having to, you invest time, or at least don't have to invest materials. So later on, as we continued to iterate the work, we started to learn, hey, you know, we like this idea of multiple lines, and we also started to like this idea of the interference pattern that we started exploring, an interference pattern that's called a moire. So the moire is kind of interesting to us because it goes back to that idea earlier in the presentation. We were talking about what's in common between our mediums. And so to us, it was kind of funny because Annica knew what moire was, and I also did as well. So moire, for those of you that don't know, is basically what you call an interference pattern. It's when you have two regular grids that intersect, but one grid is shifted or rotated or scaled, essentially transformed in some kind of way. And then you get, and when you overlay those two grids, you come up with basically a new pattern, an interference pattern. And moire is interesting because, I mean, not just because it's optically interesting, but because it actually, the word comes from watered look, and it was basically the idea of layering two sheer fabrics, and this came from the Arab world, layering two sheer fabrics that would then create this optical effect. So moire actually comes from the Arabic, and then it was borrowed by the French, and that's how it comes to us. So the original moire, the original idea of interfering these things, actually comes from the world of fabrics, from the world of textiles, and it gets adopted in technology, because if you think about it, everything that we do on a screen is based on a grid. So the projector is a grid of pixels, the screen is a grid of pixels, televisions are grids of pixels. So those are all regular grids, and sometimes they get, you know, interference patterns that, you know, for the most part, the industry thinks that they're really terrible, but you can actually explore them in interesting ways, such as in fabric, as you see over here. So more Jesus Soto, because Jesus Soto was very interested in this idea of the interference, of the optical interference. And so, we decided that we wanted to explore some of these ideas, but via our interpretation and our technological capabilities that maybe they didn't have at the time. Also, Cruz Diez invested a significant part of his career exploring the idea of the interference pattern.
Then
You
bringing in
cannot talk about Moray without talking about Bridget Riley.
in the op art movement too. So movement and vibration was something too within that perspective that we were really interested in, and we're trying to kind of bring in and push that into our work.
Right. So that leads us to sort of the next iteration of the work. We still sort of call it nervous structure, notional field. I don't know. We're kind of slippery with titles. But as you see now, we are talking about many more lines, and they tend to be more rectangular fields. But let's take a look at a quick video. Does it play? Maybe it does. Okay.
So the other thing that's happening here for me, as with my background in fiber and textiles, is now we're putting up a series of strings, which reminds me of setting up a loom when I'm threading it and making my warp. And then the other thing that's happening is the video projection that's actually being the projected on there almost becomes the weft in between. So they're kind of interfering and crossing, which actually what creates woven cloth. But then we're kind of again crossing over our mediums again with the physical and the digital.
Yeah, and even like the simulation of the graphics that are being projected, they're very much, it's basically somewhat like simulating a piece of elastic cloth that is being just traced in vertical lines. So the underlying physical simulation is similar to that. It's not exactly that, but it's similar to that. So obviously, as you can see, our work is very playful, and we don't shy away from that. We're okay with the idea of play and having fun. You can, if sometimes. I think that a lot of work can be successful if it passes the kid test, or work tends to pass the kid test.
But our work is also really about, again, thinking about the earlier work that we just showed you, and now here it was really exploring that experience and pushing that further. How can we make the viewer present? How can we let them be so much in the moment where they become part of the piece? And these pieces don't work without the viewer. So they're part of the actual piece. And those are things that we get really excited about as artists. And want to encourage that. The other thing that because we've studied our work and done it a lot too, is that we don't want to instruct people how to interact with it. So we kind of, I guess that goes back to the kid test. We kind of want something that's instant. We want to grab people. We want them to be able to be part of it and be present right away. So we kind of, over time and within iteration too, and learning from it, we've figured out ways to position the camera or where it should go within space, or how can we really make sure that it's as easy as possible for people to engage with, so they're not thinking about all these things that we're thinking about, and just be present with the work.
And we also, so that means that the interactivity that you can have with the work tends to be simple, but that doesn't mean that if the interactivity is simple, the activities that people are doing are simple. Because as you saw in all of those examples, people react to these things in different ways. Yes, there are things that most people do, and us that we've watched our work a lot, and we know, that's very typical of the way that people react in front of it. But then, there are other reactions, and they're very interesting as well. And what happens to these works too is that it's not just about the interaction. The other sort of interactive part of it, if you will, is this performative aspect that occurs. So there's usually one or two people that are performing, and then there is a crowd of people that are watching. They're watching the piece, but they're also watching the performance. And so it becomes this, I don't know, it becomes this sort of this little happening or event or a little miniature culture that occurs in front of it. It's, even though they're simple and we design them to be simple, sometimes there may be deceptively complex behaviors that emerge from it. And so these pieces can be not so big to pretty long to huge. So one of the nice things about this I guess this idea is that it scales pretty easily or pretty well. It just depends on the space and times, budgets, etc. that we're playing with, but we can, adapt the idea so that it works in all kinds of settings. So a little bit of more close up as to how this works. So as you can see over here, there's a close up of of a rail that has all those elastic cords. And then we just simply project lines on top of it, right? One of the interesting things that happened and that we weren't really expecting, but this is something that we found out by just experimenting, and again, treating this like materially or like sculptures or like experimenters really, is that, there were certain unexpected things that started happening when, say, we typically project with white light, but then when we projected on black, then we started seeing all these funky, strange colors. So those colors that you see over here in this image, they're not an artifact of the image. You can actually see them. And they're basically the light of the projector diffracting and decomposing around the lines. It's basically the projector itself creates white light by adding red, green, and blue. But when it hits when it hits small elements, you just get to see how the light sort of disperses and displaces itself, and then you start seeing the component colors of the white light of the projector.
And this was really exciting for us too, because the projector becomes a material, and light is a material too when these things are happening.
Yeah, a few more examples. Different forms,
different materials.
And again, this is like, yeah, straight up like James Terrell reference almost. But working with the projector, but now the projector becomes, the source for the interference, but there's a lot of light being reflected back into the room. So that becomes part of the installation as well. Other materials as well. So when we started realizing, well, we don't really just need to use strings, right? So anything that is a grid, we can then transform into some kind of surface where we can create moire patterns on top of. So in this case, I think this was like a Corian that we had grooved a bunch of lines on, and it ended up looking very nice. It's sort of like a stone type plastic material. And so
when we were,
go ahead.
As we were, again, exploring this idea and pushing it, we wanted to figure out how we could also bring in more senses, right? So we have people interacting with it, they're moving. So what would happen if we brought in sound? So could we make the sound just as physical or material of light in the projector, just the way that we were using making the moire and getting people to react. So with this piece, we ended up working with a musician where the sound interacts along with with the way that you're interacting with the piece
so that's-
visually.
Yeah, so the sound becomes interactive as well. And, and it was, I think, when you interact with these things, you move and the thing moves. And there's always like this bizarre, sort of feeling that something is missing. I mean, we tend to call it the disembodied embodiment, because your body is moving and your body is acting on the system that is making it change, but you're not really touching it, right? So what we really want to do with the sound is to bring back that feeling of touch, to embody the body.
And to
again.
push that, like wanting the viewer to be that present again too. Like, how can we get them there?
Right.
And again, this was site specific. So this was at the Denver Art Museum, which is
Daniel Liebskin
yeah,
building, which is just basically
lots of lines.
and lots of triangles.
And so we took advantage of that, as you can see in the shape of this piece.
And we wanted this sort of slow and, a little bit ambient, meditative.
Yeah.
But if you moved fast in front of it, as you'll see, then the system got a little bit more animated and more reactive. The sounds ended up being a little spacey, but it kind of works with his, because this museum and this building, it's basically like an alien spaceship. So I think it ended up working out. So yeah, this is the room basically lit. So as you can see, it's a bit crazy.
But it was really exciting for us because we wanted to take on that challenge of like, oh, how can we create in this space?
Right.
And what was nice about, again, there was one entrance into it. It was in a room that people had to walk probably about 30 feet back to. So there was a nice way of kind of entering the space that would kind of just keep everybody present and within the piece for a little bit longer too.
So we continue to experiment with sound. So this is the second iteration of basically our sound system for this work, and this was called Standing Wave.
But we also decided to push materials even more. So we're working with sound. Why aren't we working with foam for sound installation? What does that mean? How is sound going to reflect just not the light, but how would that reflect off the foam and with sound too? With some other questions that we were asking.
And the sculpture was, there are some issues with it, but it ended up working out once you turn off the lights,
And this also gave us a chance to kind of work more on the sound of maybe what we weren't happy with before, or how can we fine tune it. The other thing that was important with this in this sound piece too was the bass. So the sound was so loud. It was really important, especially for me, that I really wanted everybody to feel it physically. And you really could. We had 2 subwoofers in this, and you really felt the sound along with your movement too. So again, we were just questioning the same thing, but pushing it further and trying to refine it more and more.
Going back to this idea of how people interact. So, these people, for instance, decided to start doing things in pairs. At some point, there were people that were going back and forth on both of the screens. So it's interesting also to see how viewers and just simply start playing, or they start using it as a kind of strange instrument, right? And further experimentations of this concept. So this was called interference pool. Similar idea, but hey, let's just project on two objects, two sculptures that were obviously inspired by reflecting pools.
Yeah, so how could we change the interaction beyond everybody kind of waving their hands and being in front of it? What if they're looking down and reflecting on the piece? And there's still sound in this interaction too.
Things that we've done with this. So this was interactive, but it wasn't meant for the public to interact with. So we were invited to essentially provide a kind of a video backdrop to an orchestra in Denver. Basically what we did was we had the camera trained on the conductor, and we were also manipulating the settings of the program to in real time to basically start reacting more appropriately to the music. So we've also done things that are essentially, I guess, ready-made but public art. This was in Stuttgart, and we were invited to do a festival, and they had this plaza. Oops. And they, well, that went away. Oh, there it is. So they wanted us to do an installation. They already had this plaza. And we figured, well, you know, we don't need to do a sculpture. We just need to put projectors in front of this balustrade in their plaza. And, you know, it ended up being really interesting because once you take this outside of the gallery space or museum space, and all kinds of things can happen. So, for instance, the town decided to have a dance performance in front of it. And these two very talented performers did a piece based on the work and a piece of music. But then, you know, people that would have normally not gone to museums started interacting with it. There was also at some point like a Zumba class that was scheduled in front of it. And so people were doing Zumba in the middle of the night. Just, you know,
I think
people, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you just said is something to really be thinking about is what happens when you take your work outside of a gallery space too, and you work in it more in site specific, but also put it into a community space. And what's important is for us too, is that anybody can interact with our work. That it's not that you need an art degree to understand or know the history of all this, that you can just approach it and actually have this experience.
Right. Okay, so a few other works. So we've taken this idea of the moire pattern, and sometimes we do things that aren't necessarily interactive. Well, this for some reason is not moving, but it's called linear cycle. It's supposed to move, but it's not moving. Don't really know why. Maybe this will move. Yeah, this will move. So basically, these pieces are based, again, on a similar idea of a sculpture with a projection. But this time around, it's just basically this computer-based animation that's running on it. And it's just basically a series of infinite moire patterns that will generate.
And again, for me, it comes back to a lot of these weaving patterns. So like as these lines are kind of crossing over, you're getting all these, just not getting a moire. Yeah, you know, you're getting a lot of other kind of woven patterns that are kind of happening too.
And something that keeps coming up in our work is basically that we're trying to bring in display technology and putting it in a different kind of context. So essentially projectors, but we're not projecting images. We're just essentially projecting things or projecting light that reacts with a sculpture. Similarly, we're trying to do the same thing with LCD screens. So these are we're calling it the oscillation series, and they're basically animations that run on basically flat screen TVs, but in front of the TV, we place the sculpture with a myriad of reflective acrylic little slats. So, what is basically just a flat screen TV becomes more 3D.
They're not interacting, and what if this is like an animation of some sort that's being played?
And still experimenting with the same ideas of moire, interference, and physical and digital, virtual and real. Similarly with this one, L harmonics. This is based on a harmonic series of movements on lines, but then we're just again projecting on lines. The effect is subtle and maybe simple, but it's simple on its own. But if you build upon it, then it becomes a bit more interesting.
And we like simple.
We like simple. So maybe we'll sort of finish up with this little bit of coda, I guess. So manual and digital labor. So our work is very digital, but it's also very manual. So it starts digital.
And again, this is a crossover between our mediums where labor is really important within fiber and textiles, as is within the computer.
Right. So I mean, obviously you saw these guys, they're software, they react to you, et cetera, et cetera. But when they're made physically, they're also stored in the computer. So these, the sculptures, they're designed on a computer, the supports that I make a short support and I have this program that this is Fusion 360 that essentially lets me generate these supports, as long as they need to be. And they're also cut by machine. You can cut them by hand. I'm not one of those talented carpenters. So I like my machines and I like computers. I feel like computers empower me and make me things that I'm normally not very good at. So I'm a friend of the CNC. But once the computer does all these repetitive tasks that normally would be pretty boring to do by hand,
the hand still comes in. So there's that sense of labor of, this was getting ready for a piece that probably I had over 500 strings. So it's cutting all the strings, prepping the strings, and then going in, and you still have to tie a knot at the top and at the bottom. So there's a lot of, which one of the reasons why I'm attracted to fiber is I do like the labor aspect. And again, it kind of, every time we go and set these up, it goes back to me setting up the loom.
Yeah, and it's something that I wasn't used to doing because I always worked with a computer. This is basically a for loop if you're versed in programming. But a for loop in real life, by having to do things by hand, yeah, it's 1,000 of them is not. It's 1,000 times more complicated than the one time that you would have done it in the computer. So yeah, that's how those guys are doing. So a little brief, we'll just talk about this other piece and then I guess we'll leave it at that because we're running almost out of time. So this piece that was part of a show called In Sequence, and this piece in particular was Transition 2. So we wanted to basically make this sort of light tunnel experience. Yeah.
Which was in a bigger show. So this is the way that, again, talking about how are the viewers going to enter into the space. So this is how you kind of entered into the space. And then there was 4 different other pieces that we had along with this show. Yeah. Another thing that was happening within the show as people were entering was that we worked with a musician again, and there was a sound pad that went around the entire space. So you were experiencing sound in different ways as you were working through and seeing the pieces.
But in terms of the labor and how these things are constructed, so again, it's like this mix of digital and analog. So start with the space, then we come up with some kind of design, and then the design is basically made parametric. This is Rhino, if you know it. So basically, we create this little program that generates the panels these panels are then brought into a file that then, of course, because we have to integrate everything that we know, we use a video projector, we project on the wall, and here comes the hand again, because each panel of tool gets put on the wall, and then, or the studio assistants and ourselves as well, then trace the projection so that we could cut the panels out. They were very happy that that was the 100th panel. That was the last one. So after that, hang all those 100 panels and then light them, and voila, you have a piece. So yeah, again, like taking materials and taking these computer processes, but then like bringing them to the realm of the handmade. So even though we're working with computers, even though we're working with digital technology, we're still very close to the idea of the hand and the tactility. And even though we talk a lot about space and disembodied experiences, we're also talking about this very embodied experience of having to build these things, which is very, very physical. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess we're gonna leave it at that. Oh, you want to show something?
Wait, go down to this one.
This one.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this piece was also part of this exhibition, and it's called In Sequence. And again, it was tulle, which is a fabric that I've used in my own practice a lot. Fabric, what happens if we project on it? We started kind of messing around in the studio, and then we kind of made this sculpture. So again, here you see the digital on the left, and on the right was us physically having to figure out how to put all this tulle around and get up into these lengths of it. The other thing where I wanted to kind of end on this too, which was really important, again, was thinking about interaction in a different way. What our goal was, I wanted people to go underneath it and get lost. And you look up and you see this, and you get to have a moment, hopefully, which a lot of people did, and that was amazing. The other thing that happened there was I was trying to figure out how can we get people to do that without saying, lay down here. So we laid down carpet. All it took was one person to lay down, and everybody followed. And we never had to tell anybody. Everybody just kind of engaged with the piece. They knew that the carpet there was some sign or symbol that kind of happened, and people knew. And again, here it is outside of the gallery. So taking this piece again, and what happens if we make it a public sculpture and an experience. And I have to say, this is one of the best moments of my career as an artist so far, was when a woman came up, and again, this was on the street. So people were coming from a baseball game. They weren't people that would ever go into an art museum. And she was weeping, and she thanked me because she had such a great moment, and that she really needed that right then and there, even though she didn't know anything about art, but the experience that she had was that emotional for her. And those are the things that I think we both strive to really create within our work, is to let people have that moment. I think that's...
Well, and with that, yeah, I think that, let's try to, there we go. Yeah, with that, I guess we can just say thanks. If you have your handy phone, you can QR us over there, and that's the link to our Insta site, which I guess is the best way to follow us nowadays. And I guess we can answer some questions. And so Carolyn says, when I first started work, I experienced sound where there was none, and space outside of what we saw. My question is about your use of sound and what other ways sound could be employed that is generated by the viewer based on their experience with the art. Yeah, that's a good question. It's something that we thought about. As you know, sound is complicated because sometimes it's hard to understand how you are triggering it, how it's like really interacting with you. I mean, it's already hard enough to get people to understand sometimes that our projections are interactive. I mean, you'd be amazed about to the amount of people that just like cruise by it, and they just like, they had no idea that they could move in front of it. Yeah, I don't know. There's been there's a version of O movement actually that does have sound, but yeah, it ended up working really nicely. But with sound, we just tend to like to collaborate with people, people that are more specialized in it, because it's just frankly, it's just time.
Well, yeah, and we're not sound artists. So I think that's really important to know when collaborating, is knowing what you're good at and why, and then who to work with who's also good at what they're doing, right? So that's something that, and we've been lucky enough that we've worked with some really great musicians who wanted to work with us too, and kind of see what would happen with their sound and experience in the work.
Yeah, but there's other ways that you could, I guess, integrate sound. I mean, for instance, taking footsteps, or creating spaces that are naturally noisy, and then somehow that would have some kind of effect on the projector and the screen. I mean, I thought about like floors that are hollow, that are more like a little bit like a wood drum or something. I mean, that sounds all like a lot of fun, but it's a question, I guess, of time and effort and budgets that you can put into these things. I mean, for better or worse, a lot of these pieces just require a lot of space, and for bigger things like that, you also require a budget. So it's tricky to get started on these things because because it's if you're just proposing something out of thin air, maybe somebody doesn't believe that you can pull it off. So I mean, we're lucky that our concept for interaction tends to scale pretty well. So we can go for something small and then tell them, yes, we can make it huge, and it works, because we've had enough experience in a setup like that with some kind of drum floor, which sounds amazing. I don't know how that would work out, but maybe we should craft it. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else has another question.
Yeah, I actually have a question. But first, could you two stop sharing your screen for a second?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, thanks. Stop the share.
Perfect. That was great, you two. Thank you so much. Super interesting. Love to hear more and more about your work. I was curious, with the interactive part of it, have you considered like having people physically interact with the work, like entering, you're kind of doing it in the last piece that you were showing of like going under it, but like either like plucking some of the work in like nervous structure, or I have personally been inside of O movement, but other people do that, right? So like, those sorts of like enterable spaces.
Yeah.
Have you conceptualized anything like that, or yeah?
I mean, your work is a bit. You have another series of work that is a bit like that, which is funny that we didn't talk about that, but yeah, I mean, Annica has made like these sculptures that you can basically walk into. In terms of the digital interaction, it's tricky to make physical things digitally interactive, because then you're starting to build you need to build out some kind of hardware interface, electronics or a sensor or something. And in my experience with electronics and sensors and things of the sort, is that, I mean, you make them work. That's like 20% of the work. 80% of the effort goes into trying to make them work reliably. So, for instance, even in that Soto penetrable example sculpture that we showed, those strips are constantly falling out.
People just start
grabbing them. So there needs to be like a curatorial staff that's there replacing those things all the time. The Fred Sandback sculptures, we talked to people at what is it, at what's that museum in New York, at the Dia Beacon, because I was curious as to how they put the string and how often they put the strings in the floor, because the attachment is actually quite beautiful. And they were like, oh yeah, no, we put these things at least once a week, because somebody goes by, either they pluck them or they grab them and off it goes. So, building things that can physically stand the test of, even like not time, but like the test of days is tricky in the best of cases. And you add electronics to it, and then like you're your problems multiply. So I think it's more of a function of that. And in fact, I think that a lot of the things that we made interactive and the way that we made them interactive is just simply, I mean, it's also trying to come up with a solution that is practical to, you know, to the ideas that we want to communicate. Because yeah, all of these physical things that you plug things and you grab things, and it all sounds amazing. But you have to build with a robustness that maybe it exceeds what we can do as individuals at the moment.
And the thing is, if you give people a little bit, they're gonna keep taking, which we did in the Standing Wave, which was in Paris that we exhibited. And during the opening, people were going crazy, and all of a sudden some guy grabbed a piece of foam off and ripped it right off the wall. So, and that was just, I mean, there was still like, there wasn't too many boundaries on that, but like, it's again, as you get closer to work, I mean, there is reasons in museums why they say don't touch, because if we let people just touch a little bit, they're going to keep pushing it. And for us, I think that's it's like a challenge too within our work, is like, how can we like, virtually let people have that tactile kind of feeling without touching it.
Yeah, and even if you touch the work, which still produces a visual effect. I mean, if you pluck the thing, on a nervous structure, it definitely, something happens. We're also designing the sculpture so that if that happens, it's okay. And if somebody plucks the string out, it's okay. You can replace it. Doesn't require a degree in rocket engineering, to tie two knots and cut a string. But then if you start adding complexity, that's when it becomes difficult. I mean, and that's just one of the things that really annoys me going to museums and galleries. You go see like interactive work, and it's always like broken, out of order. Or it's like, it's very frustrating. So I think that the simplicity, I mean, it is sort of like something we focus on, but it does have it does have a practical reason for it, and robustness is a big part of it.
Yeah, that does make perfect sense. I had somebody else send me a message directly with a question that says, I'm curious if you ever work trying to evoke a really specific emotion through your work. From what I saw, it felt like there was a very reflective aspect of the individual experience and not meant to direct a person experiencing in a certain way.
I think they just hit the nail on
it. But it can be a collective experience as well. Yeah. I mean, it is what people make of it. I mean, I don't think that we try to be prescriptive. No. It's people can engage with it the way they want to. Yeah. And
but it is, and I think like in sequence happens to be very, kind of personal in a way when you're interacting with it for a lot of people.
It's personal, but it's not. Because,
but then there's also a community that's happening when you have 20 people all underneath it, right? Or even with nervous structure too, even though you have one person interacting, but then you have 10 people viewing it.
But sometimes you have more than one person interacting. Yeah. Sometimes you have people like, holding hands, doing waves, or running, across the screen, or doing, things that are a bit more performative. So, I mean, it's not, I mean, I think that the fact that it's like an individual that you're seeing in the video also reflects a practical matter of trying to, document these things, because there's a lot of things that happen in front of these pieces that we have not necessarily seen, because you'd have to sit there for hours and hours, and we try, but sometimes it just doesn't happen. So, but there are moments that people tell us about that sound incredible, like ballerinas going, or professional dancers, doing like impromptu routines in front of some of our interactive work. Like, yeah, that sounds, it sounds a bit collective, and it also sounds performative in this curious way. So yeah, I don't know. It's not. We don't try to be prescriptive in terms of how you feel. I mean, there's
Yeah.
feelings that, I mean, I think that
I
with the
think what
sequence,
it really-
it's very, I think that, you know,
That's a little bit different.
we are
It's
trying
a
to
little-
evoke this sort of more meditative,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
environment.
But I think the key is for all these pieces is just asking people to be present.
Yeah.
And just be with the work and you, whatever, and take it from there, really. Because, well, it's really hard to be present on a daily basis for all of us. And even being present with a piece of artwork too. So what does that mean? So I think that would be the one goal that we have with all the work.
Yeah, it's so hard not to look at your phone, you know, for like 10 minutes or 5. So just to have a moment where you can have an experience that, you know, it's not really demanding anything of you but your presence.
Mhm.
And so it kind of, you know, it can be both nothing and everything, you know, at the same time. It just sounds very, you know, philosophical, but sort of strangely Buddhist. But it is, I mean, a little bit of what we're shooting for. We don't want you to think of a feeling, but we want you to feel that you're there. And not that you have to be in 1,000 other places like modern society expects you to be.
Well, I think that is a good place for us to leave it. Asking all of you to be present. Annica, Chris, thank you so much. This was wonderful, and thank you for being in the Subtle exhibition. It's been wonderful to have your work in the gallery.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much for inviting us.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. For all of you watching, this has also been part of Studio 300. If you are on campus, there's also starting right now concerts about digital music that are taking place. So please go and check those out, and please come by the gallery tomorrow to see Cuppetelli and Mendoza's work in person for one last time before we sadly have to take it down. And you two have a wonderful, wonderful evening, and everyone out there, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.